Okay, so I am, and I also feel like a newcomer to the study of the Caribbean. And my interest developed through engagements with students in the classroom, here as a teacher in the university in the field of theater studies, and through a realization after I had been living in the Netherlands for about a decade that I knew close to nothing. Not only did I know close to nothing about different colonial histories and sites, but for that matter, neither did any of my students. So for me, I started really purely out of trying to catch up, curiosity, trying to read and so on, and through involvement with various students who also pointed me and opened the doors out for me to explore the Caribbean. So maybe I should go straight to what I want to share. So I find David Scott's call, I read it in an interview somewhere, to think from the Caribbean, a fitting motto for how I would like to approach the field. And today, David, you spoke about rethink the Caribbean, but I actually think thinking from the Caribbean is a better phrase as far as it goes for me. So to think from the Caribbean is not to think the Caribbean, as for that would be a colonial project, but it's also not to think as Caribbean. That's another deal. So to think from the Caribbean is to actually imagine, to put yourself in another vantage point, from another vantage point. So to think, for example, sovereignty, the question of sovereignty from the vantage point of the Caribbean, is to perhaps not be so attached to the question of the territory or to anxieties around the nation state. To think issues such as gender from the Caribbean is to perhaps inhabit the small scale and to hang in there, to see what it does to our notions of periphery and center, majority and minority, norm and exception. To think of art and culture from the Caribbean might mean to question the boundaries that separate art and craft, high and low brow, popular and experimental. And to think intellectual traditions from the Caribbean might perhaps also imply not only paying attention to outstanding, famous, or lesser-known figures, to their writings, to their material intellectual legacies, but also to develop a kind of sensitivity to very eclectic, very multi-directional conceptions of kinship. So to me, to think intellectual tradition could also mean to think of the grounds in which different forms of kinship emerge, which form the ground for something which we might call an intellectual tradition. So I thought this is an interesting idea for me to pursue. And in the way Wayne announced or explained the idea of this workshop to me, I also felt there is this certain tension in the idea of saying, let's try to identify what's specifically Dutch Caribbean intellectual tradition. That, of course, has the risk of continuing some form of discourse of Dutch locational exceptionalism. Or it might end up, like Suzanne was saying earlier this morning, putting too much emphasis on colonization and therefore on the Netherlands, and therefore in the process, you looking for something very specifically Dutch Caribbean, you come back to the Netherlands. But if one were to not go down that route, and I fully agree that that should not be the intention, then I think it might be worthwhile to also imagine tradition in terms of kinship, in terms of relations and webs and nodes of affiliation, which include but are by no means restricted to bloodline or ancestry, which are dynamic, which are not linear, which are very eclectic and even promiscuous, if you like. So what if we looked for kinship as a way of approaching intellectual traditions in the Caribbean, imaginations of kinship, but verwantschap, which is not just blood relation. So when you ask the question in this way, then immediately gender and sexuality come center stage. And so many feminist theorists, historians have argued, of course, the very category of citizen in the context of the Caribbean is entrenched in nationalist frameworks and powerful institutions such as the Roman Catholic Church, which have historically excluded women, the enslaved, as well as other subjects deemed as abnormal or non-respectable from equal citizenship. So arguments on the notions of propriety and respectability play a very important role in defining what tradition is and who gets to kind of belong to a certain tradition. And these discourses, of course, as you know, extend to the very well into the present day, sometimes under this benevolent mantle of development. But even more broadly, if we think that the idea of a nation is often delineated in gendered terms, for example, how common it is to speak of the birth of a nation, of adopting citizenship, of motherlands, fatherlands, of founding fathers, of sons of the soil, mother tongues, brother nations. So, or for example, colonizing nations being depicted as parents and the colonized as children. So this kind of nexus of the way in which a certain tradition and national kind of tradition is soaked in gendered language and gendered imagery, I think is interesting, and it's interesting to think in different ways in how it works in the Caribbean. So my own disciplinary training is in theater studies and in literary cultural analysis. So what I found fascinating was to look in a number of examples. I encountered in a number of examples a self-description of the colonized in terms of rather unconventional forms of kinship with different parts of the world. And I felt this is something I don't easily see, for example, in literature in India. I want to just mention a few examples and kind of leave it there and ask you more what you think about this. So Astrid Roemer famously wrote, Met Suriname ben ik getrouwd, Nederland is mijn minnaar, met Afrika heb ik een homofiele relatie en met elk ander land ben ik geneigd slippertjes te maken. So I'm married to Suriname, the Netherlands is my lover. With Africa, I have a homoerotic relationship, and I'm inclined to hanky-panky with every other country. So in this kind of humorous, sharp manner, Astrid Roemer describes the relationship between Suriname, Netherlands, Africa, and other parts of the world in erotic terms. So it's not just about the papers we have or about histories of migration, civic political systems. There is this dimension of curiosity, fascination, a dimension of long-term commitment. The Netherlands is a lover, but you don't really have to pay the bills or something for this love. A light-footed, messy, complicated terrain. And these kind of elaborations about thinking about one's own place in the Caribbean in relation to questions of desire and intimacy, one finds in many, many different examples. Félix de Roy begins his autobiographical compilation, Ego Documenta, with the following statement. So I'll just read out a small extract. He says, as the hidden heir to the colonial orgasm, as the extramarital bastard exorcised from the European Testament, I escaped the prison of genetic and historical identity. I became a refugee in the mythical country of the mixed race, la race mélangée, the no man's land, the mongrel race. Beneath the skin and between the sheets, against the tide of racial exclusion and nationalistic rejection. So what I find intriguing in these kind of articulations is that, of course, we see a well-known trope of créolité, but it's given an erotic twist. And Félix de Roy describes himself, he describes his aesthetic credo not only in terms of being a product of different races and places, but of his sharing intimacies with all of them. Créolité is not only about the skin and about bloodline, but it's also about what happens between the sheets. Colonialism is figured as orgasm, as violence and pleasure in a kind of double bind. And so I think this trope, or the trope of kinship, and of kinship which is kind of contaminated, which is not along the usual lines of mother-father linear history, is interesting in the way in Caribbean literature is somehow provoked. And probably these are examples which are very well known to many of you here. But to me, this was another example of a poem where I found an articulation on the one side about sexuality, and on the other side speaking about the relationship between one's country and its colonial past. Edgar Kairos' poem, Dat Boelgedicht. So I don't know whether I should just read from the poem. It uses a lot of specific words. But you see, the poem is about an articulation of bisexuality, of being attracted to both men and women, and actually about men and women being attracted to him. But it's not just about that. Suriname can be connoted as female, the Netherlands can be connoted as male, or the other way around. And then bisexuality becomes the marker of a certain kind of national identity which is not bound to the loyalty to one nation state. And it brings with it both pleasure and loneliness. It brings both pleasure as well as despair. And Cairo describes himself as a fufuruman, a thief, who steals love from both men and women. And to me, I think this can also be read as the way in which one is stealing from both the colonized and the colonizer. Another instance is Frida Martinez's performative text, Geschiedenis, a combination and a play of the words misschien and geschiedenis. So geschiedenis read as history from the male-dominated perspective. So she says, men zegt mij wat gij is geschied. And this is contrasted with geschiedenis, my story, but also the possible story, the story that could have been. So in these kind of plays of words, you have the possibility of a her story as opposed to the history from above, the story of above. And it's also the story from a woman's perspective being contrasted with the dominant narrative of the male story, the gij schiet, geschiedenis. And in her performative text, Geschiedenis, she also speaks of reclaiming practices such as singing, dancing, and cooking and cleaning, looked down upon as menial female labor, but she reads them as tools of sustaining kinship, ways of which, and so these are forms of kinship which are outside the usual political economic order. They are forms of some sort of resistance. She reads it as a kind of resistance and self-articulation. And the final poem I'd like to share with you is by the Curaçaoan writer and performer Nidia Ekuri. It's titled Ruína. And interestingly, in her own translation from the Papiamentu, Ruína becomes, in English, Home Sweet Home. So ruin and home sweet home. And we encounter a kind of delineation of kinship here, which is speaking about the process of a house turning into a ruin. The house is, of course, one's home, but it's also the homeland. It's also a certain understanding of a body, which is being taken over by termites. And she speaks. So I just read out a few parts of that poem in her own English translation. Servants, the most faithful even, have departed. The crab walked into the parlor and sat down in the rocking chair of guaranteed, authentic origin. The clock's party hat has settled in a lopsided position, as though the fun is yet to start. At our expense, ever at our expense, the termites are having a ball. So in this portrayal of home, one's own place, as a ruin, there's on the one side a very heavy indictment, a critique of the homeland, which has been given a chance and which allows itself to be eaten by termites, if you like, taken over by illusions. But at the same time, it's a place of salvaging memories. And I somehow am fascinated with this sort of anti-heroic, unsentimental way of relating to homeland, relating to tradition that one calls one's own. And I just wanted to hear your thoughts about what you think of exploring this in terms of thinking intellectual tradition along the lines of kinship. So that's my bit, actually.
Thank you, Suti. And I think we just asked Laura to come up and I think we kind of both together. Yeah?
Yes. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this colloquy. So I want to thank Suzanne and Wayne for gathering us for this workshop, and also David Scott for his presence. And I also want to thank you, David, for my personal copy of your beautiful book on Stuart Hall's voice. So I will be talking today about a plan for further research centering on sexuality in the Caribbean, in the Dutch Caribbean. But I will immediately say that I will not execute this plan myself because there are too many other projects on my desk that I need to attend to. So whoever is interested in this project, take it to wherever you see fit. My starting point is this. Among the many contributions that the Dutch Caribbean, notably Suriname, but also the Dutch Antilles, has made to Caribbean intellectual traditions are thoughts and practices in the sexual domain. So I'm talking specifically about what in Suriname is called the Mati work. So the Mati work is a very old institution. Yeah, okay. It's a very old institution, first written about in 1912. It pertains to the phenomenon that is existing both among women and among men. Mostly the phenomenon has been described from the point of view of women, where women have sexual and erotic relationships with men and with women, either simultaneously or consecutively. Women typically have children, but their long-term relationships are with other women. This is what is called the Mati work. So I will be thinking and talking about that. So that this is a very old institution. It has piqued the curiosity of many historians, anthropologists. As I said, it is the phenomena in which women have erotic and sexual relationships with men and with women, either simultaneously or consecutively. Working class Afro-Surinamese women typically have children, since parenthood is deemed a most important symbol of realizing one's humanity and adulthood. So there are sexual and erotic relationships with men, but importantly, the longitudinal relationships that women have are with other women, with whom they share the daily burdens of life, but also the joys of life. So the muddy work exists among both women and men, but most publications have been about women. And I think this is because in the West, women have typically been seen as sexually not that interested, not that curious. It was rare for historians and anthropologists coming in from the West and doing research in Suriname. It was rare to come across a female population in Paramaribo that was so clearly interested in sex and in relationships with other women. So scholars have studied the female mati work. There are hardly any studies about the male mati work. The first one is a Dutch civil servant in 1912, A.G. Schimmelpenninck van der Ooyen. Then there is Melville and Frances Herskovich, who write about mati culture in the early 30s. That is published in this thick volume, Suriname Folklore. Then we encounter Rudolf van Lier, Tropische Tribaden, Tropical Tribates, in 1986. Ineke van Wetering, about the manifestation of the mati work in the Netherlands, where it had traveled after 1975. The book it's a series of articles by Van Wetering. Then I wrote my dissertation about the mati work in 1992. It is called I Am a Gold Coin. I pass through many hands, but I do not lose my value. Later, I published a more encompassing book, which is called The Politics of Passion, in 2006. So I have argued in this book, The Politics of Passion. It is Suriname that is arguably the African diasporic site where grammatical principles, as Mintz and Price call it, in the sexual domain, have been taken up most fully and most wholly by the enslaved population, and where people were able to elaborate freely upon those principles. It is present, the phenomenon of same-sex relationships, coupled with opposite-sex relationships, is present in more areas of the African diaspora in the New World, for example, in Curaçao, Grenada and Carriacou, Jamaica, the southern US, St. Lucia, among others. But it was nowhere as clearly present as it was in Suriname. And this is the case for two reasons. There are demographic circumstances where during most eras of slavery, there was a numerical relation where it was 15 black people to one white person. And in plantation districts, this ratio in the 18th and 19th century was like 65 black people to one white person. So these numbers weighed heavily in favor of the enslaved developing their own linguistic and sexual cultures. So that is one reason, the demographic circumstances that make the mati work stand out so much in Suriname. But I'm arguing it's present in other parts of the African diaspora in the Caribbean. This first reason is strengthened by the Dutch colonial regime, which kept the enslaved as far away as possible from the colonizers, spatially and culturally, but of course not sexually, because there were a lot of sexual encounters between male colonizers and female enslaved. So I studied this Mati work, as others had done before me, and it became quite clear to me in the late 80s, early 90s, when I was doing my PhD at UCLA, that we had learned a lot about the lives of the enslaved, their food intake, family patterns, music, religions, etc., etc., but not about how they envisioned being sexual persons in the world. So it seems incongruous, oxymoronic to couple intellectual tradition, the topic of today, with sexuality and gender. Yet I want to make precisely that combination. I want to defend that combination because it is clear that in traditional Western thought, certainly in academic thought for the longest time, sexuality has been relegated to the lowlier, baser aspects of human existence, a domain basically to be shunned, not the way to get ahead professionally. But I'm arguing, as I have been ever since I did my PhD on this topic, that we have a lot to learn out of the understandings of Afro-Surinamese sexuality. So my entry points in the proposal that I want to make are the intersections of sexuality, gender, race, ethnicity, and identity. I want to put question marks behind identity because what I have been arguing basically is that in this universe that I have been studying of working class Afro-Surinamese women who engage in same-sex and opposite-sex sexual relationships, it is that they are not thinking about sexual identity, an essence that is lodged on the inside. They are thinking about sexuality in terms of activity, and it doesn't claim an identity. So, Surinamese authors have written about sexuality. Here I'm coming to propose a new kind of project that would further this interest in the ways that Afro-Surinamese people have given shape to their sexuality. I would like to look as a next step, which again I'm not going to execute myself, but I'm offering it up to you as something that would be really worthwhile, to look at the work that Surinamese literary authors have done on sexuality. In a Surinamese, Afro-Surinamese working class setting, it is not the gender of one's object of affection and attraction that is the most salient feature in an Afro-Surinamese working class setting. The gender of one's object of affection and attraction is not the most important. Sexuality per se is important for one's inner harmony and pleasure. It is not whether it's heterosexual or bisexual or homosexual. And so what I would like to propose, if a new project that I would deem worthwhile, would be an extensive reading of how several authors have written about sexuality, same-sex and opposite sex. So I would be interested in a reading of authors like Edgar, Kairos, Astrid Roemer, Bea Vianen. From the English-speaking Caribbean, I would, of course, be interested in a rereading of Audre Lorde, who can be linked to Grenada and Carriacou, Michelle Cliff from Jamaica, Dion Brandt from Trinidad and Tobago, and there will be more authors that would fit into such a project, how literary authors have envisioned sexuality, both same-sex and opposite sex. And also I would like to include Indian Caribbean writers. So there are several reasons why I would be interested in such a project, but one of it surely is that it foregrounds Caribbean women as actors in this sexual system. So unlike the ways that we have envisioned sexuality in the West, in which women are waiting patiently for the male to pay sexual attention to them, in this system we see that Caribbean women are actively seeking out sexuality with other women and with men. And so we see Caribbean women as actors in the sexual system, and also many commentators, many people writing about this, thinkers about sexuality have been women. There is also a certain urgency to this project that I'm proposing. When I did research for my PhD, that was in 1991, I found a very rich life of Surinamese Mati, Afro-Surinamese Mati, also with women of other ethnic groups involved in the Mati work, Hindustani women, Japanese women. Since that time, many of these respondents that I had have died. Of course, there are still Mati, both male and female, in Suriname, but I also notice a strong tendency to leave the terminology, the understandings that have been transmitted by our ancestors to us, to leave that behind in favor of modern Western terminology like I am a lesbian, I'm a tomboy, even I'm queer, one can hear, whereas before women were talking in terms of I'm doing the Mati work, not claiming an identity, I am this and that, but using a verb. I'm doing me Mati, I'm doing the Mati work. So there is, in some respects, a very precipitous change going on under the influence of globalization, in which modern Western understandings of sexuality are cannibalizing this system of the Mati work. So I feel a certain urgency in proposing this subject to look at how literary authors have looked at the Mati work, and especially, of course, Astrid Roemer and Edgar Kairos will be important figures to study, to contend with. Yes. So part of what we are struggling against is that older Mati have died. There are still younger Mati around who are totally into this older framework of I'm doing the Mati work and not claiming an inside identity. But I feel that it is important to, at this stage, also look at the way that literary authors have given shape to their imaginations of same-sex and opposite-sex sexuality. So that's it.
And then we have a few minutes of questions quickly. So, Shruti, question around questions of kinship and whether or not that is a fruitful way to think it through. And Gloria raised something as well, which Susan and I were thinking about with the project, which was your second reason, which is around what we at the time we were thinking about the project called pragmatic governance. So how we in the Netherlands govern certain things. So for example, why is it so that the relationship to gender and sexuality or to sexuality, you could see that more visibility in the Dutch Caribbean than probably other places, so in terms of government. But also, somebody else brought it to my mind, Rivka, Jaffe, about the fact that even in relationship to prostitution, and the rules in relationship to prostitution in the Dutch Caribbean were so different from the rules in relationship to prostitution in other parts of the Caribbean, which meant that there was a different regime that was going on. So that is something that is important to think through. What is that regime of governance that allows or disallows that? I know, for example, Small Axe did a project called
Caribbean Queer Sexuality.
So sexuality, sociality.
Visuality.
Caribbean Queer Visuality. So this misfit, this wasn't it. All right. So questions, comments, and we have a few minutes. Good. David, and then Alessandra, and then David.
No, that's fine. Go ahead. That's fine.
Well, so when I speak a little bit, I'm kind of obsessed. I am obsessed with. And it brings the intellectual, and then I'll bring it into why I'm so excited about what you just said, is that there is a space in which talking about the Caribbean amongst Caribbean is incredibly important, and there's also a space that I'm very much involved in, which is talking to people who aren't Caribbean, who could care less about the Caribbean, why the Caribbean is important for them. And what I find very scary is that oftentimes those very people end up hijacking something that has been going on for decades in the academy and for centuries in thought without citational practices. And so this is a space where I think it's happening. And I'm citing a book discussion I was part of called After Trans Studies by Andrea Long-Chu and Emmett Parson-Drager, in which they talk about the emptiness of the term trans. And what is fascinating is they're saying this term means nothing because it's a catch-all for everything, and everybody can identify with it. And whom do they cite to recuperate it? David Scott. And what I find really, so this brings into what both of you are saying, but especially how Gloria's work has, both your books have informed so much these conversations I have with myself and with people, is what happens when we get to the end of queer studies and trans studies, which is happening right now with these very well-circuited and well-known writers who are writing for the New York Times, when they then end up hijacking concepts without the citational practices that need to happen. And that's where I feel there needs to be a huge imposition, intervention that says, we have been thinking the act of sexuality for a long time for reasons that are absolutely in dialogue with what Foucault was doing, because we're outside of the Foucauldian heteronormative family. And we need you to notice that we did this, so that the conversation doesn't get completely forgotten, and then it's yet again a white space that claims that as its own. And the parallel to me is, I think, when Vanessa Agar-Jones said, how could you be terming this term post-humanism when we've been post-human since, for 400 years, right? So it's the same sort of dynamic. And I think in terms of the question of today, other intellectuals, it has what you've done, but also really positioning it for me as we've been doing it for so long. And those are my spaces in which I'm constantly in dialogue with people who are never reading anything that I'm reading. So yeah, anyway, I talked too long.
So is this question directed?
It was not a question, it's more just, I'm so excited about you making a call for this work to happen.
Okay, thank you.
And that the Dutch is there. Like if we look at only, say, Eka Natasha's work, right, who cites you constantly. But now she's working on Tinsley, Natasha Tinsley?
Yeah. Aisley's Mirror.
Yeah, exactly.
I loved it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And you are behind that. But in terms of thinking about what is the contribution of Dutch Caribbean scholarship, that gets forgotten when it passes through then Tinsley and then into the people with whom Tinsley is in contact, and mostly then the white people who take up Tinsley's work. And that's my fear, is that then the Dutch part gets completely forgotten.
Yes, okay. I agree.
Yes, thank you very much for those two presentations. I have a question for each of you. Sylvia, I wanted to hear you riff more on your idea of a tradition, which is a notion that I have been worrying over and around for some time now. And part of, and I'm interested in the idea of the relationship between tradition and a kind of fractured conception of kinship that I hear you want to bring into being that's not reducible to bloodlines. And if we think of what a tradition does as partly about belonging, about some conception of belonging, some conception of inheritance, right? That something is passed on, some conception of a community. How does kinship allow one to tie together the work that we assume or that we want a tradition to do? And how do we think of traditions both in terms of understanding cultural traditions in some form, and also intellectual traditions, inheritances that are embodied in some form, but that are part of the way in which we argue over who we are. And to get to the question of tradition and the question of who we are, identity, belonging, inheritance, community. So I want to hear, and Gloria, like Alessandra, I was very keenly interested and admiring of the call that you make. And I think that it's the same interest here as one that Alessandra articulated a while ago. The sense in which, and one knows this now through feminist and queer interventions in thinking or rethinking the idea of the Caribbean family, which was so fundamental to the anthropological making of the Caribbean, and to the production of a kind of normative and a heteronormative sense of what a family is. And the suggestion that there are embedded in, embodied in various kinds of gendered Caribbean practices, unnoticed by or governed by colonial practices of one sort or another, that we have lost sight of the variety of kinds of intimacies that were embodied in Caribbean Caribbean practice that were not or could not be simply reduced to the colonial languages of what a nuclear family was. And I think that's really worth exploring. How do we decenter the normativities in the anthropological language of the family, through which, in some sense, the modern Caribbean has been imagined and reimagined?
Yeah, so in fact, that's exact. I think you summarized what I was trying to get at, is that if we are, before we start saying, okay, what are the intellectual traditions that exist here and there, can we stop and ask, along what lines do we imagine how tradition is formed and how tradition forms us, us or whoever, a group of people, a community. And if it is not only bloodline, I think the interesting thing for me around the works which I cited is that it's not just about bloodline, but it's also about some kind of bloodshed. And and this is not my own idea. It's an idea that actually Judith Butler develops in her book on kinship, Antigone's Claim, and where she says that, I don't know, the story of Antigone is actually outside of the polis, and she's burying her brother. She's claiming kinship. She's claiming her blood relation to her brother, but at the same time, she's showing a certain kind of response to acting as a citizen, claiming her rights to the citizen. So she's also responding to the bloodshed that happened, which killed her brother, and so on. But if we think of if we are fracturing kinship, not only about father-son, and in this heteronormative idea of father-son and so on, but we think of kinship as lateral around relationships between siblings, between cousins, and between those with whom we share intimate relations on transversal levels, then it gives another dimension to identity, belonging, and also about responsibility. Because if our kinship is not just what I inherit, tradition is not just what I inherit, but it's about my obligation, what I'm obliged to do in order for this tradition to stay alive, to be dynamic, to move on, then it somehow frees us from that anxiety of conserving tradition. I think that's what I find interesting in the works which have been mentioned, and I feel there's much more out there, and the Caribbean is an interesting place to think about that, because these lines of transversal lines are really going around in many parts of the world. So I found this remarkable, that it's about establishing a kind of kinship which has some sort of internationalist dimension, almost, if you like.
But Shruti, one of the things that, why is it that for you the Caribbean appears, I imagine that there are many people in this room who would say, yes, absolutely, obviously. But why is it that the Caribbean appears to you to be a paradigmatic geopolitical, historical space in which this particular conception of a fracturing notion of a tradition is exemplified? I think that,
I don't have an answer. I don't have an answer, but I think there's something there in these whole conceptions of creolite and so forth, which is about more than just the plurality of things that happened in one place in history and so on. There's more there as a paradigm to learn from other things, being from another place, such as India or from Europe, etc. But I don't quite have a causal answer to that.
But what is nice, actually, I think what is nice in that, and what perhaps for me, I've been thinking through, is exactly going back to what that notion of bloodshed means. That notion, because you start with bloodshed as this catastrophe. It has that already in it a fracture, right? And I think for me, especially always thinking about the Caribbean in this way, as what it offers to us is to start thinking through fracture. It already gives a splintering already. And bloodshed, there's a point when you said it, there's a Jamaican nest that comes out of that, which is already nice. Blood, that's splattering, which I think also for me is about that transversal and not necessarily the higher glory.
David, can you please repeat your question to me?
if it was a question.
Right.
If it was a question.
I think that part of what I hear, and I think that Natasha thinks this work resonates here, is the sense in which our understandings of the family and kinship and the intimacies and sexual relationships that are supposed to be constituted in that have in many ways been produced discursively and materially by a governing regime of knowledge and colonial practice that has sought to sediment a certain perception of what a family is, of what normal sexual relationships are, who is to be with who, etc., etc. That has cauterized, papered over, made invisible other modalities of being together, of modes of intimacy like Matty were, that you're trying to recover and to make visible in and so my question, if indeed it is a question, is how do we, I mean, partly it's a question of knowledge, which is why you set it out as an invitation for us to take up, is what does it take, do you think, to undo the kind of anthropological normativities that have given us such a regimented conception of who we should be as sexual beings, or as family beings, or as intimate beings?
Right. Well, like how much time do we have here?
1 minute, so.
What I would say, so for the longest time, we are looking at the Caribbean from a Western perspective as a site where all kinds of unholy sexual arrangements are taking place that are not normative. Then at a certain point, historians and anthropologists start looking at Caribbean sexualities in a different way, like how do people think, what is it they do, what do they find important, kind of trying to present an emic picture of what sexuality can be. What is striking in that is that, for example, women play a very active role in that, much more so than we have been given to think from a Western perspective. In a Western perspective, women are supposed to be sitting at home and waiting around, whereas these Caribbean women are really actively seeking out partners, sexual partners. So we are confronted with a totally different system that gives agency to women. What we see happening now, so that has been studied, that particular phenomenon of the Mati work that I'm convinced, took with us from West Africa, has taken shape in different ways in different parts of the Caribbean. It's present all over the place. Now, that is a particular way of living sexuality that is at odds with our ideas, that our received ideas that are circulating in the West. But what I see happening very much the last times that I have been in Suriname, which recently has been from November to March, I was in Suriname, that this Mati work is vastly receding. There are still a couple of people who call themselves Mati, but the thing that is everywhere is I'm queer, I'm a tomboy, I'm this, that, and the other, which I find so sad that this way of living and way of thinking is under siege, and that the things that people are involved with in the gay movement is an agenda of equal rights, like we also want to be recognized by the government, we want to be able to marry, all those kinds of liberal rights that are out there, which totally weren't an issue during all these centuries in which the Mati work thrived. So that is what is driving me to propose a project that again wants to look at what it means emically to be in the Mati work. Not to say, I am a lesbian, I'm doing the Mati work, what that entails.
And there is, in this kind of intellectual generosity that Gloria exemplifies, she just says, I conceive a project, go and do it.
Yeah.
That doesn't happen anymore. You have to compete for everything. But also in the kind of thinking what kinship might mean as an intellectual project. Those are the kinds of things that we want to be talking about. So thank you both. We're going to make a quick transition to Alessandra, who has to run for...
Well, I'm staying till exactly 4, so I really want to listen to everybody, so I almost would rather give up my speaking to listen to everybody. If you can't make it till 4. I could give a quick rundown or something.
Yeah, give a quick rundown.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
How do I make it a quick rundown? I will make it a quick rundown. So for me, I came to this very recently because being in contact with Wayne 2 days ago, and I'm teaching 28 hours a week in 5 different institutions. But this is an important part of how I framed it also, is that being in 5 different Dutch institutions in varying departments, and also still being affiliated with City College of New York, it's become very clear to me that your second book applies just as much to the Dutch space as it does to City College of New York, not necessarily New York institutions. And I can talk about that more if anybody wants to discuss. But what it has given me is what I tried to do today is think about questions, because I am not at all specialized in the Dutch Caribbean. However, I think because I've been working across within these two academies actively and in touch with students, and also because of my work in the French Caribbean, so especially the Dom, so the Martinique and Guadeloupe, and also I consider myself a Haitian scholar. But how do I do it? And those are where my questions come from, is I am constantly, I think I'm one of the few scholars I know who is very dedicated to attending, being part of discussions in African studies, and also in post-colonial studies, even though I don't consider myself a post-colonialist. But that's where my work gets published and how I serve it. And because I'm in these two spaces, and you could think of one as mostly black scholars, to make it simple, and one white scholars. And then maybe people going back and forth between them. And because I'm also of Jewish heritage, I've become very aware of what it meant to be of Jewish heritage at the City College of New York and our hiring practices, which is again why Gloria's second book really spoke to me, and her first book was incredibly important to me for my work in thinking about Vodou. So when I did my work on Vodou, I was looking to present to audiences that had always, or scholars who had always considered it as a religion or a spiritual space, but say it's also a thought system. So that's where I'm coming from. So I'm obsessed right now with who is hired and how that determines which students will study and want to become professors, and how many of those will how many of those will then get jobs, and those who get the jobs or have the potential for getting the jobs, and that goes to the emotional labor you were speaking about, is who will sustain the emotional labor and have the staying power. And I think there's, to me, very scary situation where I used to be a full-time faculty member, and then what you describe in your book. And how does this have to do with the Dutch Caribbean? So one of my first experiences that really struck me was the Keti Koti Festival, and seeing a woman on the tram here, and I understood very little Dutch at the time, but I wrote it down, went home, and I was pretty sure I was right, and it wasn't us, a white woman, it was the Jews. And so this question of Jewishness and scholarship has been something that I have had to work through. It's not what I'm working on now, but it's something that I had to work through. And so this is a question I bring up, and so looking at, and here I'll read a little bit, in working recently on an article titled Raphael Confiant, who's a Martinican scholar, and Jewishness, or Fanon, Palestine, and the Fraught Landscapes of French Martinican and Franco-Martinican Intellectualisms, what struck both myself and Sarah Phillips-Castile, who's editing the volume to which it belongs, is an obvious but grossly under-theorized fact. Namely, the French Caribbean was divided up during the Second World War based on its affiliations to the Allied or Axis powers. In the case of present-day Martinican intellectual Raphael Confiant, his 1990s and early 2000s inattention to or misunderstanding of Jewishness, and he's been accused of anti-Semitism, and I refute that accusation in the article, may in fact have had to do in part with Martinique's political role during the Second World War. No other event underscores the particularity of this role and its relationship to the Holocaust than the recent 2017 publication by Haitian author Louis-Philippe d'Alembert of the novel, translated, Before the Shadows Disappear, a literary history of how Haitian consulates issued passports to hundreds of Jews fleeing Nazism. In Haiti, if Haiti was the seat of La France Libre in the Americas, then Martinique was for all intents and purposes quite the opposite. While Admiral Georges Robert was supposed to safeguard neutrality in Guadeloupe, Martinique, and Guyana, he in fact collaborated actively with the Vichy government. And the question that comes, that's one question, and the other intervention is thinking about how, so here we have, Britain was definitely on the right side of the war, right? And the Netherlands and France, in a way, have this bizarre, comparable narrative vis-a-vis Jewishness and the Holocaust. And why does this even matter for the Caribbean? Well, it matters because what happens, I think, is that perhaps the eschewing of Dutch scholars has to do, of Dutch Caribbean scholars, has to do with they didn't have a space to circuit. And a question I have for scholars who are in the Dutch space is, at least France had Sartre, and with all of the problems that Sartre did and all the problems of what it means to write prefaces for Fanon and prefaces for Césaire, he still was writing prefaces for them. And he still was very actively an anti-colonialist, whereas in so many spaces there wasn't even a white prominent intellectual who took the side of anti-colonialism. And that leads into the second intervention, which is how a recent history of human rights studies has absolutely obfuscated, erased, and evacuated anti-colonial struggles. And there's a beautiful article by Joseph Slaughter, who has an incredible citational practice, who basically takes down the foremost historian of human rights studies today, Samuel Moyne, for locating human rights history its beginning in 1977. And again, the reason he says this is because there is a discomfort amongst scholars who don't openly self-identify as Jewish in relationship to what Sarah Phillips-Castile calls the dialectic of Africana Jewish intellectualism. So while this doesn't seem very important, I think in the Netherlands it's extremely important, because clearly there's this I've heard this from other people besides the woman on the train with her who was going to say that it wasn't her, but it was Jews who caused the Dutch involvement in slavery. But there's clearly a huge discomfort around Jewishness, and who was allowed to be part of a dialogue on that. And so, and finally, that leads me into the third point, which is I think there is such a discomfort around anger. This is seemingly also unrelated, but what does it mean for an intellectual to be angry? And are they even discredited as an intellectual the minute that they are angry? And so this is a very influential book, especially in Europe, called Multi-Directional Memory, Remembering the Holocaust in the Age of Decolonization by Michael Rothberg. And although Michael Rothberg puts forward this idea of multi-directional memory, the way he puts it forward in the foreword is in an incredibly condescending way, talking down to a homologue intellectual who shows anger vis-a-vis constructing a museum on the Washington Mall that would be comparable to the Holocaust Museum for the history of the African diaspora. And so to finalize it, I'll just ask these three questions. And what I was very excited about, and again, this is not a project I can do or am interested, well, I'm super interested in someone doing it, and that's why I'm excited to hear the next talks about Anton de Kom, is just reading his basic biography, I'm excited to know that he went to Haiti, and I really believe, and I've written about this, that when the scholars who have worked in Haiti, their scholarship really changes after that moment, and he was there for a year, from what I understand. And the second is that he wrote actively for newspapers and magazines during the Dutch resistance and actively joined it. And finally, the last question is a bit of Lisa Lowe's expression, the intimacies of four continents, something that I think the Dutch Caribbean has, which maybe plagues it, I don't know, is the fact that the anti-colonial struggle was so early on, and the Bandung Conference was so early on, so there's this intimacy, or at least there's a dialogue between the Asian element and the Caribbean element, and it was repressed, perhaps, it's a question because I'm not a specialist, so early on that then it becomes eschewed and silenced in a way that it doesn't happen, say, in France when those post-colonial moments came later than the Indonesian moment. And so then a scholar such as Anton de Kom, is he eschewed for the very reason that the Dutch government is actively repressing any space that is of its own, so one that is Asian and one that is Caribbean. And so yeah, I'll just kind of end it with that. These are I really want to listen to everybody else, and so I condensed everything. But so yeah, okay.
No, can I embarrass her? Great question. Yeah, I'm going to embarrass her. She's a contemporary artist. She's working on an art project for those now. Actually engaged with some of these topics. And last 2 weeks ago, we had some photographs. She was actually looking at the fact that she's from Kairos, yes. Her parents are Jewish, yeah. Grandparents.
I know my mother, yeah.
Yeah. Yes. And she was looking at some photographs, and I love seeing these early photographs. And she was just reflecting on this one photograph where you said, "This is how what they look like, your grandparents, when they reached Kairos." Immediately they had become a part of the elite. Mm-hmm. Right before that, they were never a part of the elite. They become elite, and she has photographing. So that's a part of the work that she's going to do. And so therefore your work touches on something else which is important to think through along the engagement in terms of Jewishness within the Caribbean as well. So that is also something that we don't have here in this conversation, but also extend to another end. Sorry, Quincy. Because I'm very interested, and I'm going to promise you now, we need to do a conference on anger. I think we need to do a workshop, not a conference. On anger. And the ways in which this very narrative of anger, activism, and blackness is understood here, or post-colonial activism is understood here, and pushed back. So I think that is something important as well, that you brought. Can I know, thank you, Gloria did something which is a little bit of a slippage. I don't know if any of you noticed that Gloria claimed Audre Lorde It's Caribbean. There will be a lot of people who are angry out there. Nice. Okay, let's go to the questions of the intellectual tradition. Oh, no, sorry, I'm going to cut you. So, I think you start.
People watching online, yeah. People watching online.
Yes.
It's sunny outside.
Oh, there are a few people who might be seeing. So, who knows you start? Yes.
Okay.
You can sit if you want, because the mic is there.
I have a PowerPoint.
Okay. Julia?
So I have this one. 15 minutes, okay. I'm going to put. Okay, if you please do it. Wacht even, mijn.
Welke is het?
Ja, ik ga het eventjes zelf doen. Even kijken. Diavoorstelling.
Hier, die.
Oh ja, deze hè?
Ja.
Het grote scherm kan. Oh ja, hij staat al op. Oké. Ja. So I want to look at the relationship between citizenship, violence, and the afterlives of colonialism by rereading Anton de Kom. And it was only recently that I started, as a sideline of my work, look at Anton de Kom. And it is for this occasion that I've digged it up. I did the reading, and then the invitation came, and I thought, well, this is the moment to say something about it. So this is kind of like the spirit of my talk. Ask not what dominant conceptions of citizenship can tell about the lives of the colonized. Ask what the lived experiences and perspectives of the colonized reveal about the unacknowledged and violent formative shadows of modern citizenship. And that is what I will try to do. My work has been largely a response to these universalist, inclusive, progressive conceptions of citizenship, which I think are also very Eurocentric, and it is a response to it in that regard. There is this dominant idea about what citizenship is. And let me check, where is it again? Yeah. Okay. Respect, rights, dignity, and status equality. Citizenship is a weighty, monumental, humanist word. And these are words by Fraser and Gordon, in which they critique this universalist, inclusive model of citizenship. And the elements of this idea of citizenship is the following. It is the idea that modern citizenship and modern law as being opposed to racism, racial exclusion, and social inequalities. And this is still very dominant also in conversations with colleagues of mine within the law department. And I see it also reflected in citizenship studies in the interdisciplinary field of citizenship. And it consists of a number of premises, namely that the law and citizenship are more or less connected with justice and equality, at least in a formal sense, that modern law and modern citizenship are antidotes to social inequalities, that citizenship status is a predictor of certain inalienable rights, and and that and there is also the idea, so besides the idea of formal equality and inalienable rights, there is also this progressive temporality that is connected with citizenship, as it was, for instance, first formulated by T.H. Marshall in his famous essay, in which he suggests the thickening of citizenship via the addition of civic rights first, and then political rights and social rights. So this idea of the gradual thickening of citizenship, of modern citizenship. And I recently read an article by a very famous scholar in the Netherlands, who did a study on the historic development of Dutch citizenship, and he didn't mention a word about colonialism. And I think this is very... Well, it was Willem Schinkel. And it's a Foucauldian scholar. But colonialism and the implications of colonialism for citizenship were completely absent. And I value his work, but I thought that was kind of like, a serious slip. Yeah, a serious slip. Recently there has been, especially in the humanities, we have seen in the Netherlands the development of bringing colony and metropole into one analytical framework, especially in relation to slavery. And this approach is much less visible among migration scholars, and also not among the scholars who are working on citizenship. So yeah. So situating citizenship in one analytical, in an analytical framework that includes metropole, colonies, and the colonial afterlives, reveals dynamics, functions, and temporalities that contradict universalist, inclusive, and progressive notions on citizenship. It reveals how modern citizenship was implicated in the formation of hierarchies that conditioned the maximum exploitation of the colonized and laid the foundation for the unequal distribution of scarce resources between the global north and the global south. And Anton de Kom's Wij Slaven van Suriname is an intervention it can be reread as a fundamental critique on modern citizenship, on the assumptions of modern citizenship. Yeah. But around the same time that I reread Anton de Kom, I came across a very interesting book. It was my father who gave me the book, and it contained. It was a dictionary, a German dictionary, or more precisely, it was a dictionary made by a German missionary. And in addition to the dictionary, there was a collection of 707 Sranantongo proverbs, and it was very interesting, this collection of works, because it is an example of how the colonized responded to slavery, a vernacular example of how they did it. And one of the sayings in that book was "Mina kakalaka, mino ability na foru mofo." Mina kalaka, mino ability na foru mofo, which means I'm a cockroach. I have no rights in the bird's beak. And I heard this proverb already when I was very young, so it was not something new. But I saw it in the book, and I was surprised by it. And the proverb, to me, it articulates a relationship between power, rights, and citizenship And it can also be read as a deconstruction of the sugar-coated universalisms of law and citizenship. And when I start reading Anton de Kom, to my surprise, the same saying appeared in Anton de Kom, and it was, the entire quote is on the top. The law that considers the slave personal property and chattel was strictly maintained. Among Surinamers, the following proverb was developed: the cockroach has no right in the bird's beak. So this is just to indicate that Anton de Kom was nurtured by a much broader anti-colonial critiques that were articulated in the vernaculars, such as proverbs. And it strikes me as, I think, a very important observation that Anton de Kom, and I think many other Dutch Caribbean anti-colonial critics, did not put these epistemological boundaries in their work. The ones we are very familiar with today. It was critical thinking was a very it was connected with a wider social sphere, with a vernacular culture. And Anton de Kom, in Wij Slaven van Suriname, he unpacks this proverb. And let me then look at certain proverbs that he unpacked. I don't know if I will be able to discuss them all. But the next proverb is a quote about the role of the Dutch sovereign in slavery and the slave trade. So it's a very long Dutch quote. I will not translate it entirely. But it is interesting because he points to the very, very clear and very direct connection between the Dutch sovereign and slavery. So it was not that they were innocent in that sense about slavery in the colonies. They were very aware of it. And also, if you look at the sources in Parliament, in parliamentary debates, you can really see that there was an awareness among the members of the Dutch Parliament that there was a legal contradiction that was going on between what was happening in the metropole and what was happening in the colonies. So, and I found that interesting. That Anton de Kom observed this and that he was aware of it. There are a lot of quotes in Wij Slaven van Suriname about the connection between property rights, exploitation, torture, and death. And they appear in many pages in Anton de Kom. Yeah, and it is really so. Property rights in Wij Slaven Suriname is not only connected with ownership, the ownership of the enslaved bodies, but it's also about the right to destroy enslaved bodies. And in that sense, citizenship and the right to torture and kill enslaved bodies is put forward. That it. What is also striking, I think, and it's something that we need to unpack further, is that slavery provided the context in which European women could articulate property rights via the ownership of enslaved bodies, and also, with the practices of torture that were at the core of it. And this is, of course, a very different idea of emancipation than the ones we usually think of when we think of emancipation in the metropole. But it should also be remembered in this regard that in the domain of sexuality, things were very different. White women could not articulate their property rights. They could articulate their property rights, but they did not enjoy the sexual freedoms that white men had. So it was a very complex colonial formation in this sense. I would also say that Anton de Kom had an intersectional awareness, and this quote really is about the different role of men and women during slavery. Yeah, that women were both they worked on the field, but at the same time they were also sexually exploited. So Anton de Kom was aware of that, of the different position of men and women under slavery. A lot of quotes also refer to how criminal law was instrumental in torturing enslaved bodies, and you know the examples that Anton de Kom uses are very striking. A lot of attention in Wij Slaven van Suriname is paid to marronage, and I must say that manumission is largely absent in Wij Slaven van Suriname. And of course, marronage can be viewed as the transgression of the principles of modern citizenship. If you consider that the people who fled to the interior of the country completely, dissociated from this idea of modern citizenship. The whole idea of the individual entitlements to land and to bodies and to etc. It's the negation of modern citizenship, marronage. What I found interesting is the absence of manumission in Anton de Kom, Wij Slaven van Suriname. He practically pays no attention to it, and it is as if the institution did not exist. But of course, getting ownership of your body, being recognized as a personal legal subject, was of course a trajectory of freedom. But the freedom was of course a conditioned freedom. It was a freedom that also made a part of the people that got manumission complicit in slavery. If we keep in mind that a part of the formerly enslaved also became slave owners within the context of slavery. And it should also be mentioned that I think recently I've written about it, that it, in a certain sense, manumission also laid the foundation for a very stratified, racialized society. If you consider that not everyone had the same chances to get manumitted, especially the mixed offspring of the European men and black women had a bigger chance of getting manumission. So if you think about the present-day pigmentocracies in the Caribbean, we should also go back to this institution of manumission, I think. There is also in Wij Slaven van Suriname attention there is attention given to the exploitation of indentured laborers and also their resistance to it. But there is much less about the role of the law and citizenship. And from other sources we know that second-class citizenship of the indentured laborers and also elements of international law were the instruments of continued exploitation of under indentured labor. We also had the punale sanctie, the punitive sanction, which brought reapplied the principle of criminal law to labor conflicts, which was a very repressive system in Suriname, and it led to many uprisings among the indentured laborers. So if you only look at Anton de Kom, you see that you have a very different idea of the development of modern citizenship. It is anchored in colonial hierarchies. These hierarchies served the purpose of the maximum exploitation of colonized bodies, of racialized bodies, and it eventually also led to the very uneven distribution of scarce resources between the global north and the global south. If you think about the expansion of rights, it is for me very problematic to disconnect the rise of social rights in the metropole from slavery. I think slavery as an institution laid the foundation for capitalism, for the industrialization of the West, and also for the emerging welfare state. So you get a very different idea of it. Wayne says that I have to stop, and I will stop, but not after I say that. You can see a lot of regressive tendencies. If you look at the history of slavery, it was not the advent of a more equal society, but even in present-day societies, you can see a lot of instabilities of citizenship as they connect to people from the colonies. The debates on Antillean Dutch citizenship, for instance, the proposals to put an end to free migration, the proposals by Geert Wilders on denationalizing Moroccans. So these regressive tendencies are still there, and I'm in the process of reconceptualizing citizenship as a form of violence, not as something that needs to be perfected, but something that is inherently violent, and that's what I'm working on right now. Thank you.
All right, can we go to Carmen and then just quickly, and then I'm going to, because I'm really going to push the time now. Thank you. Don't worry. I'm not so sure I have it right, but in the Dutch context, emancipation meant citizenship, right? You were emancipated to citizen in '63.
Yeah, but
in '63 you were emancipated to citizen.
Yeah.
In the British context, that's different, right? At emancipation, you were still colonial subjects, but not citizens. Very different. Very.
But when would you gain the right to vote?
Yeah, right to vote 1942. No, that's what I'm interested in. Then what did citizenship mean?
If you don't have the right to vote,
Yeah.
yes, that's interesting. Yeah. We're celebrating now 100 years of voting rights for Dutch women, but not. It never mentions that quite a few men and women under Dutch rule were not allowed to vote in that year. All right. So there are many ways to commit sort of career suicide as a historian. Being angry would be one, so that's good. Going into the history of Jews and slavery would be another nice way of making it very difficult for yourself. And then there is a third way that would be talking about communism. So I'll do the last one. But what I wanted to say is the 26th of June there will be the Dag van Eliezer, which you know about it. Okay, good. Okay. So there seems to be a difficulty in many circles of dealing with Anton de Kom and acknowledging the fact that he was a communist and that his ideas were shaped in dialogue with this movement. It has become a very unpopular movement. Marxism is also very unpopular as a way of way of thinking or a place to have your discussions. Despite what you might read in some press, I don't think that there are any Marxist historians left in the Netherlands. Maybe Pepijn Brandon, who on his own sort of holds the banner. But in many areas of our remembrance of heroes, someone who's made into a hero like Anton de Kom, the fact that he was supported by the communist movement and that he developed his thinking in dialogue with this movement has disappeared. And I've published a small article on this in a Dutch journal for history, Tijdschrift voor Geschiedenis, where I talk about three places, so to say, where this memory of his communist past are being erased. One is the the Surinamese government, who have made him a national hero, put his face on banknotes and named a university after him and did all these things, but don't like to really talk about his actual politics beyond a nice sort of we're a nation and everybody is part of it. Some anti-racist activists who have taken Anton de Kom as their hero also don't really like this part of his politics. And the third group, I think most influential actually, has been the family of Anton de Kom, who really don't like to be reminded of his political position that he had at the time. And I'll go into that a bit more because it's connected very closely to why his English translation is still not published. So I think that's relevant for today. Just to be sure, if you read the work, if you read Wij Slaven van Suriname, it's very clear that he has an active, he has a real conversation with activists of his time, with international communist writers as well. So the first author that is cited is Magdalena Paz, who was a French Trotskyite-leaning author who wrote several books but was very involved in some campaigns that de Kom was also involved in. The second chapter of his book leans very heavily on this Marxist concept of primitive accumulation and on the work by Werner Zombart, and shows very clearly a sort of this historical process. The historical development is shaped by class struggle and so forth. Also in his era of freedom, and I think Guno already talked a bit about it, the third chapter is what he calls the era of freedom, so after the end of slavery, and he is of course very cynical about what freedom means, and also there you can very clearly see that he has this sort of Marxist understanding of freedom and how much freedom is there if you're being exploited and so forth. There is even a sort of a faint echo of the Russian Revolution audible in how he perceives sort of a transition to a new society in Suriname. So class and exploitation are really at the core of what he's doing in Wij Slaven van Suriname. His biographers really deny this and don't want to see it. Voortman and Boots. They wrote a very thick biography, 50 euros. I think 500 pages, and they try to make him more palatable, more respectable, and not seen as this angry radical who follows this irrational creed, so to say. To me, that's very strange if you read the actual text of Wij Slaven van Suriname. In the closing chapter, you see that he attacks the social democratic activists in Suriname itself, and he does so in a very sort of typical style of the communists of his days. It's similar style, similar arguments. And he talks about the crushing of the before mentioned uprisings by the unemployed as the Red October. But then, why is this being erased? Why is this so uneasy? Of course, that has to do with much to do with the end of the Cold War and these ideologies falling out of favor. But it's also very clear that the family of de Kom played a very active role in this. And starting with actually de Kom's wife, Borsboom, Nel Borsboom, who lost basically her husband to his activism and to him wanting to be involved as an activist before the war. It's his activism that got them deported from Suriname back to the Netherlands, and then during the war, when he stays active, publishes in communist newspapers. This is what gets him arrested, and then is the end of him. And so we have sort of this quotes, citations from Nell Borsboom saying, well, it's this dirty politics that have done him in. And so this is something that the family regarded as, well, we lost our father. Maybe you consider him in your activist circles as some big hero, but we lost our father because of what he did, our husband, etc. As far as I can see, this has continued over the generations, that every time political movements tried to take Anton de Kom as their hero, the family has started boycotts or has started something to stop that from happening. And one of these occasions was the publishing of the English translation of his book. The book was translated in 1986. By a very famous translator, Pomerans. He also translated the Van Gogh letters and did big things. He translated it for the family, and he gave all his rights to the family. Normally, a translator would keep translation, the rights, the copyrights of the translation themselves, but here it was transferred in full to the family. The family went to different publishers trying to get it published, and it's clear that among themselves they were conflicted. They tried two publishers in the UK, but they couldn't come to an agreement. And then someone took the initiative to go to the KTLV, the Royal Dutch Institute for Caribbean and Southeast Asian Studies. But then part of the family objected, saying, well, this is a colonial institution and we cannot have our the work of de Kom published here. Fine, so that didn't happen. That was, I think, attempt number 3. And so by the time that we started trying to make another English translation, it came to pass that Pluto Press was actually interested in publishing the translation. So we were very happy. It's very good that you ask. It's Antonia Carmona Baez who did the Smash the Pillars book, right? And he was sort of the driving force behind this project. I was just attached onto it, so it's absolutely his work. But then the family said, no, you cannot do it, and we still have the rights over the text because it was not that long ago. The copyright of the original text was still in the hands of the family. So we waited until it was 70 years after the death of the author, thinking that we could then go ahead and publish the translation. We had made contact with the wife of the translator. The translator had passed away. The wife of the translator, the owner of his estate, saying, well, I'll give you the right to publish this translation. And so it was almost in print by Pluto Press. Everything had been checked and done, and all of a sudden the family reappeared saying, no, this is not going to happen. And we tried to have a conversation with them. They were first very upset by the introduction to the text, which, well, they might have had a point. It was a bit too optimistic about Suriname at the time. And, well, okay, we said, if you don't like the introduction, we'll take the introduction out. Right, we'll just publish the text, and then the representative of the family at the time said very clearly, no, Pluto Press is a politically colored press. We were like, yes, obviously it is. Look at what kind of book they're going to publish, of course. And Pluto Press stands, I think, very clearly in the same kind of tradition. But well, they said no. This is too political. So that got me fired up about thinking. Okay, why? How is this such a? Why is there such an uneasy relation between what the text actually is, where it comes from, what it represents, what's there, and this fear of it being everything being too political? At this point, I have withdrawn completely from this whole project. I'll also end my talk here. I've withdrawn from it completely, but I really hope that someone will make a new translation and has the copyrights in their own hands, and then just publish this this text, because I really think it deserves to be read within the wider Caribbean, and only having a Spanish translation is not enough.
Was je er wel helemaal klaar Ze willen het gewoon uitleggen eigenlijk. Nee.
Hoe lang heb ik? 10 minuten?
Ja.
There is a Cuban one and a Bolivarian Venezuelan one. So, yeah, 8 minutes.
I won't, sure. Okay, sure. Okay, then I'll get started. Thank you for the invitation. And as Wayne noticed, I have way too many slides to show. So I'll skip some of them quickly, and I hope to share some of the thoughts and the work that I and my team of the Black Archives are doing currently. And it's titled Waves and Movements, and what we're trying to explore are different waves of anti-racist and anti-colonial or Dutch radical movements in Suriname and the Netherlands. So I think a lot of the people which are present here know the work that we do, so I can skip the introduction about how the Black Archives came into being. So that as a student organization, because we found that there was not enough attention being given to Black histories and narratives in the Dutch educational system. And a few years ago, we were approached by Chemo and Miguel Halbron, and together with them, we started with the collection of their late father, Waldo Halbron, who had left behind a huge collection of books. And Waldo himself thought about these issues critically as well. In one of his booklets, he stated that often what is being presented as history is merely a reconstruction of the past. It's not as neutral and objective as we often think. Instead, within this reconstruction, we often see the dominant narratives in which certain voices, certain stories are often erased or suppressed or silenced. So we started in Amsterdam North, moved to the building of Vereniging Ons Suriname right around the corner. And in this building, in the collection of the association, which exists 100 years this year, we found a very fascinating collection of books, documents, and artifacts. And currently we're in the middle of the process of literally unpacking boxes with these very interesting documents. So I just want to share the rough sketches and thoughts that we have currently about this ideas of waves of anti-racism. And that idea started because of some of the texts that we read of Miss Esset, Philomena Esset, in a very recent interview in the Groene Amsterdammer. One of the things she stated was that 3 decades ago, after the first anti-racism wave started, and 10 years after she left the Netherlands, it, being racism, became on top of the societal agenda again. And a few years ago, she also published this article titled A Second Wave of Dutch Resistance Against Racism. It really sparked our thinking about this question about, okay, so if what is happening now is the second wave, and the first wave apparently happened in the 80s, what about the time before the 80s? I hope we can have some time for discussion with Mevrouw Wekker. I found this a beautiful picture, so I added it. Because in an interview with New Value also kind of used this idea of a second wave of anti-racism, and stated that the first wave happened or occurred during the 1980s. So as I said, we're trying to explore this idea of waves and different movements of anti-racism and anti-colonialism. Now, I'll skip this because of time, but these are some images of the 1980s when you had several organizations and movements of Surinamese, Dutch Caribbean, and all other immigrant communities mobilizing against this problem. However, whilst doing the work at the Black Archives, we found out that there's much more history, there are much more interesting movements and waves, you could say, who organized around anti-colonialism and anti-racism. So a question we have is, how should we think about these movements? So On Suriname started in 1919. And at first it was more of a cultural association where, you know, the early migrants, mostly from the upper class, tried to, you know, support one another. And there was a lot of solidarity as well with the, what they call the stowaways, people from the lower class who came here semi-illegally. And only after the Second World War, you saw that within the organization, yeah, things shifted. People got politicized during the Second World War. And especially when the couple, Otto and Hermine Huiswoud, came to the Netherlands, you saw that there was a shift in the way that people within the organization started to think and organize as well. And what I find interesting is that last year, as a lot of you know, we organized a exhibition called Black and Revolutionary, the story about Otto and Hermine Huiswoud. And we've been talking a lot to a lot of audiences about it, with all kinds of different people, but in almost all of the settings that we come, the vast majority of the people have never heard about them, even within circles of people who are actively engaged with, you know, these histories. So, briefly, Otto was born in 1893 in Suriname. At a very young age, he ended up in New York. He became the only black co-founder of the Communist Party, became very active in this international network of black communists and black radicals, together with Hermine. And after the Second World War, I'm giving the very short version now, they ended up right here in Amsterdam within this association. And during your introduction, Suzanne, you mentioned Eddie Bruma, who was or is seen, as you said, as, you know, one of the spearheads, one of the icons of Surinamese nationalism. And what's interesting about this period in the 1950s is that you saw that, you know, different people came together. On the one hand, you had Otto and Hermine Huiswoud with a few decades of experience in these international radical movements. You had a lot of young people, students such as Eddie Bruma, joining the organization, meeting with people like Otto Huiswoud. You had working class people, more and more working class people coming to the Netherlands. And when you look at the international context, it was a time or a period of time where, you know, there was a lot of growth of consciousness around issues of anti-colonialism, decolonization. So currently we're trying to think about, you know, what happened in this moment, what happened in this period, in this decade of the 1950s. And a lot happened, much more that I can say within the few minutes that I have here. So I think I'm just going to show a few examples of interesting moments, interesting things that happened. For example, that Eddie Bruma, Huiswoud, and people were part of different organizations such as We Egisani and On Suriname, came together and wrote up this manifesto against the statute, which tried to, at least on paper, give more autonomy to the former colonies in what they call the West, the Suriname and the Dutch Caribbean islands. And what's interesting is that different organizations coexisted, and a lot of people who were part of these organizations were active in both of them. So on the one hand, you had Eddie Bruma, the leader of We Egisani, which is known for cultural nationalism, trying to re-evaluate and revalue Surinamese language, culture, through all kinds of productions, literature, poetry, theater. But at the same time, a lot of the people who were board members of We Egisani were also part of on Suriname. So there was a lot of cooperation within this period of the early 50s. At the same time, when you look at the publications of this period, for example, the Courier, you saw that there was a lot of thinking going on about these international questions of decolonization and anti-colonialism. Kitikoti was a very important moment on which people came together and mobilized people. So these are a few examples of things that they organized. One of the things that Otto and Hermie attended was the first International Conference of Negro Writers and Artists, where you had people like Aimé Césaire, Frantz Fanon, Leopold Senghor, and other Caribbean and African intellectuals. So, what did it mean that they were there, and what kind of ideas did they take from attending these kinds of events? Du Bois, both Shirley and W.E.B. Du Bois, came to Amsterdam to give a lecture at the association. They were in touch with Langston Hughes for a span of a few decades. So it shows that there has been a much longer history of this international network of black thinkers, black radical thinkers, if you will.
En zo wie is die middelste, bovenste rij?
Middelste is Aimé Césaire.
Okay.
Yeah. And something that I'm thinking about currently, because we're in the midst of doing the research, as I said, is that I think there's a very important shift between the 1950s and the 1960s, 70s, because on the one hand you have a person or people like Eddie Brima who go back to Suriname. They set up the Sani in Suriname, then they start the National Socialist Movement, I believe, NBS, and later on the PNR, so it really translates into a political party with the aim to gain independence based on nationalism. But within this period there becomes there's a break between on Suriname and the PNR. Why? This is one of the booklets that I read a few days ago, last week. It's called Imperialism and Class Struggle in Suriname. And what's interesting is that the people who remained active on Suriname were very critical of Bruma and the PNR because they found that they were too narrow in their thinking. They were too much focused on, Surinamese nationalism and gaining independence, and did not give enough attention to, broader questions of imperialism. So they make the distinction between pseudo-independence, where indeed Suriname gained political independence, but at the same time Dutch and American companies such as Billiton, Shell, etc., still controlled much of the economy and the country. And they found that these nationalists gave too little attention to these questions of imperialism and neocolonialism. And I'm seeing that I already spoke longer than 10 minutes, so I'm gonna skip a few things. But these are a few examples of the pamphlets that they wrote in this period of the 1960s and 70s, which shows this growing anti-imperialist and anti-neocolonial thinking within the association. So this says what is ours, what is of the people should stay of the people. Bauxite plus people means welfare. Bauxite plus imperialism means exploitation. And this from the mid-1960s. What's interesting as well, in my opinion, is that they had a very internationalist vision. So they talked about how the United Fruit Company, for example, was exploiting all kinds of Caribbean and Latin American countries. You see the slogan, Yankee exploiters stay out of Suriname, and other slogans like that. So again, you still see this international, and I'm going to wrap it up in a few minutes. You see that they were part of an international movement of anti-colonial, anti-imperial thinkers. These are letters between the Surinamese Students Association and CLR James, and they invited him to talk about several topics such as the political situation in the Caribbean around that time. I think this is a beautiful cartoon of this, very big person symbolizing these Dutch and American companies exploiting the resources in Suriname. So, as I said, I have way too many slides, unfortunately. But I'll go to the end. Sorry? Yeah, Ronald Snijders, Anton de Komp's daughter, Judith. But what I found actually interesting is the Black Panther logo on the back, which was one of the logos of one of the youth movements called the Democratisch Jongerenfront. So, yeah, in the mid-70s, you see a shift, because on the one hand, more and more people from Suriname come to the Netherlands and they start to focus more on anti-racism here, but at the same time, they are still very connected to the anti-colonial movement in Suriname. Then the coup happens, and the focus shifts towards anti-racism in the Netherlands. So, a few questions we have, and I'll end with that. How are the works of these anti-colonial, post-colonial Dutch Caribbean thinkers and organizers mobilized and remembered within struggles over race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, and political belonging in the Netherlands? And how were these ideas and information exchanged within, inter-Caribbean, etc. networks? And I'm going to skip a lot of slides. So I'm going to end with this. This is just a very broad sketch in which we try to, say that yes, there have been, different ways of anti-racism, but what would it mean if we put them in a much broader historical perspective of other Surinamese and Dutch Caribbean anti-colonial and anti-imperial movements? But next time I can hopefully share much more.
Michel, that we're going to have a day just for him. 88 slides. Thank you, man. What we're going to do now is that I think what probably best is to bring all of the presenters to an end. So with 10 minutes each, is that fine? Yeah? So first,
I have to go. Is Olivia going to talk?
Yes, Olivia.
Is talking now?
Yes. Olivia is going to talk to end Anton de Kom, and then we have 2 presentations on art, and then we have a closing discussion. Yes? Is that all right? And then after that, some of us who wants to still sit and excuse me, who want to have a coffee and have a closing conversation, we'll do that downstairs. All right?
I'll be quick.
So thank you so much, Wayne, for having invited me to come. This is a challenge to me because I'm not a specialist on either Caribbean thought or even Dutch Caribbean thought. But I feel like invited to think about many issues that makes part of my everyday when I'm in Suriname doing research about another subject. And so this invitation was an opportunity to go through another reading of Anton de Kom. So I beg your patience to hear one more presentation about de Kom. But I will benefit from my colleagues that present a lot of information about his biography and his publication. And so I use my presentation to go into a very specific, singular way of reading de Kom from another point of view. Anton de Kom Wees Leven van Suriname is an intriguing text, and I explain why. The biographers and specialists on de Kom know little about the writing process, the conditions of reflection that result in the book, or the procedures he used. Anton de Kom used it to gather information from archives and library in the Netherlands during the early 1930s. However, this general lack of knowledge, also mentioned by the author's biographers and consistently analyzed by historians and specialists, is not what makes Anton de Comte's book not only an interesting piece, but an entangled artifact. Its quality is an intricate text derives from the fact that the book and author cannot be separated. They form a single composite of political and existential engagements that were later transformed decades after the author and the writing appear on the Surinamese political scene. Information on the coming from the Comte's coming of age as a political actor and an author is sparse. The book gathers inscriptions produced by other observers, colonial historians, and the press through notes that describe the onset of political turmoil dreaded by the colonial authorities and the limited repercussions caused by the book publication in mid-1930s. The book as life and de Comte's life as a mass of inscriptions form an artifact that can be neither separate nor disentangled. Fragments of data on the Comte come as archival pieces of evidence, contacts with politicians from the left of the political spectrum, letters, possible encounters with Indonesian nationalists in the Netherlands, all of which form a kind of historical knowledge in which the making of the Comte as a subject and author appears to be considered through the lenses of his future readers. A new generation of Surinamese and their descendants born in the Netherlands who, in different ways, participated in the debates concerning decolonization, independence, and sovereignty. But for sure, you might argue that the fact of being intricate also reveals potentialities. It opens itself up to renewed critical readings. It shows nuances of certain passages. It enables connections with other books and ideas, preserving at the same time what Walter Benjamin has called an aura, a sense of the book and its author as something indecipherable. These features, of course, cannot be attributed to the we slave of Suriname alone as a singularity, since we could enumerate the very same characteristics to describe other masterpieces of the Caribbean thought, but they can be defined as potentialities, since it does not cease to entice us into some form of critical and creative engagement. This is the way I have chosen to reread Anton de Comte's book, retaining his biographies and the historiographical analysis on his brief period of political and intellectual activity and his life as productive engagement. This introduction is also an excuse made by a non-specialist on the history of Suriname, on Caribbean thought, or, as Wayne instigates us to reflect, on radicalism as a critical instance adopted in Caribbean political writings. What might my engagement be, and why do I prefer to deal with Anton de Comte's book as an original artifact? An original object or artifact is something that mobilizes, sometimes captures our attention and our senses, yet in one way or another affects us. As an anthropologist, I should add that I have been interested not only in the political dimensions of these affects and effects, but primarily I have sought to understand how they are transformed into practices of knowledge. So let me explore, albeit very, very briefly, I promise, two issues that reconnect Decon's idea as they appear in the book. History as a genre. Decon has created a narrative genre in which the histories of colonialism in Suriname could no longer be narrated as a succession of data, a succession of chronology, a list of authorities, or accounts of gains and losses oriented by a logic of possession and territorialization. Instead, Antoine Decon's historical account assumes an embodied existence. Past and present do not stand apart, therefore, as planes in which time and chronology are related. The very invention of an instance of observation along with a composite persona, the we, people, and the slaves of Suriname, to narrate and turn the pages of new papers to check and cite figures from colonial statistics and historiography. As an invention, this genre of history suggests a refusal to reproduce the authorized colonial account, but also to transform the author's commitment into a fiction, neither romance nor tragedy. Decon's narrative creatively displaces the voice of the distant and supposedly disinterested author, a compiler of data, and transform himself into a situated observer. Thus, all the gathered data, figures, and fragments included in the text are constituted as engaged knowledge practices. The history of the colony is not only displaced from where it had been recounted until then, but also incarnated. It becomes produced by a body that suffers, talks, remembers, and listens to other voices. But the history told by Decon also embodies other subjects. It's striking just how much marronage occupies the center of his narrative, how the slaves' revolts and the maroon presence are transformed into a model of relationship. When explaining the history of the fatherland, Decon observes that if the colonial history deserved heroes, why not choose warriors like Bonnie and Baron? Why were the latter and other maroon examples in the fight against plantation violence not taught as young kids, little black children like Decon? It is striking to note how the diverse fragments, Decon uses his own body to lend a sense of justice and legitimacy to the genre of historicity. Contrary to Pierre Bourdieu's idea of embodied history, in Decon's narrative, the body is history. Its very condition of possibility, the child's body, the slave woman body, the maroon bodies, all of them appear as subjects coveted by a predator and the latter's enduring legacy. This unique strategy of highlighting the different layers of historical effects and the effects that made the bodies of the slaves in Suriname visible project into the future various moral dilemmas concerning the making of history and its regimes of authenticity. as David Scott and others authors have demonstrated, though these features cannot be attributed solely to Cohn's book. We need to ask, therefore, what happens to the Cohn narrative when it is approximated and related to another corpus of knowledge? Or, put otherwise, what happens when the Cohn's thought is mobilized to authenticate other political debates or use it merely as a source of documentary evidence to them? Here, perhaps, we need to ask what kinds of connection might be established between the Cohn's book and other Caribbean thinkers. Because of the lack of time and the fact that my reflection still requires further readings and work, let me move quickly toward a conclusion and to a very, very quickly exploration on what I refer to as side effects in the title, an idea that I intend to re-examine in depth if and when this note assume the guise of an articulated text. Accepting Wayne's invitation to read the so-called Dutch radicals, Caribbean Dutch radicals, on the broad tradition of critical Caribbean thought, I realized that my first reading of Weyes, Leven van Suriname was unusual. I was interested in the production of a generation of Afro-Cuban authors who participated critically in the discussion about the need to rewrite colonial histories in the early 1960s. This involved a continuing intellectual work of translation, compilation, and archival research conducted by a new generation of Afro-Cuban intellectuals. My first contact with the Cohn's book was by chance. Moved by a curiosity about Suriname and the slavery rather than about the Cohn himself, I purchased the Spanish translation of his book published by Casas de las Americas, an institution then directed by the Cuban painter Mariano Rodriguez. Thus, my first contact with the Cohn was bounded by a complex and tense context of disputes over the making of history in the Cuban revolutionary aftermath. The date of the publication of the translation marks the peak of writings on slaves and slavery by authors such as José Luciano Franco, Rogelio Martinez Furé, Nancy Morejon, Sara Gomez, Pedro Pérez Sarduy, and others. This generation of Afro-Cuban authors, followed by the footstep of a highly controversial book published in 1961 by the law graduate and ethnology student Valtério Carbonell. His Crítica, Como Surgió la Cultura Nacional, Critic, How Cuban's National Culture Emerged, challenged precisely the propositions of a colonial history that many revolutionary intellectuals and authorities uncritically insisted on reproducing. In particular, Carbonell called on his interlocutors to disembody the martyrologies of José Martí and other national white heroes, and proposed choosing not only the slaves and their descendants in their fights against slavery and discrimination, but also the likes of Palomonte and Regla de Ocha as powerful actants that need to be recognized in the making of a new national history. Carbonell's critical writing is full of metaphors relating to the body of the nation and criticism of its hierarchic forms. It's unlikely that Carbonell had read or even had heard about the con. Carbonell's reference were the generation of Afro-Cuban journalists from the 19th century. I'm closing the last paragraph. From the 19th century, like Rafael Serra and others, combined by his interactions with African and African-American authors in Paris in the late 1950s and early 60s, with the Algerian communist circles. At the same time, when the Con's book was translated in Cuba, Valterio Carbonell was imprisoned and isolated in psychiatric institution, his book banned and forbidden to circulate. We lack any information on who brought Anton de Con's book, including its possible editions in Dutch, who authored the preface, who edited the notes, and for what purpose, and aimed at what kind of readership. What leads me to insert Valterio Carbonell's book into a discussion on Dutch Caribbean thinkers like De Con is the desire to test what I called side effects. Despite being published in different contexts and for distinct audience, both texts, Carbonell's and De Con, call us to reflect on the birth of genres of history, genres of histories that I would like to call tentatively carnal history, a historicity that is only incarnated, but not only incarnated, but also made into flesh and blood inscription. Thank you so much.
Does anybody have anything in the lockers downstairs? Okay, good.
All right, go. Yeah. So first, Anthony Boakes is part of this sort of research group too. So Stephanie and I will be presenting together today on behalf of him as well. And we will be talking a bit about historical exhibitions of Caribbean artists in Amsterdam that were organized by the Stedelijk Museum in the post-war period, as to sort of study the ideological needs and curatorial strategies that informed the representation of Caribbean art during the processes of decolonization in the Dutch Caribbean in the 50s. It is our wish to turn this sort of preliminary research into a larger curatorial project about Caribbean cultural practices and conversations in post-war Amsterdam. And part of that is to rethink actually the vocabulary that has been used to frame and present Caribbean art. So in this presentation, the Stedelijk Museum exhibition history and sort of modest collection of Caribbean art function as starting points to engage with the Caribbean artists, artworks, exhibitions and interlocutors that were present in the transnational exchange between Amsterdam and the Caribbean in the post-war period. Caribbean artistic practices came into sight of European art institutions through expanded artistic mobility and migration, as well as international exhibition programs. And process of decolonization in the Caribbean increased the circulation of art and ideas between the region and Europe and constituted what we could call a Caribbean presence in cities like Amsterdam. The Caribbean seems a pivotal site for a curatorial approach that is concerned with connections, relationships, and shared experiences. Yet when we look at the exhibition histories of modern and contemporary art institutions such as the Stedelijk, its exhibitions before 45 did not explore or intensify the relationships between the Dutch Caribbean and artistic developments in other parts of the world. In discussions on Dutch Caribbean artworks, connections were often ways to define how Caribbean art was derivative of European traditions. This somewhat changed with at the museum with the appointment of director Willem Sandberg in 45, when the museum started to present contemporary art from the Caribbean, after Sandberg's visit to Curaçao and Haiti in 49, broadening the international scope of the museum a bit. So the Curaçao Museum was founded by the artist couple Chris and Lucilla Engels a year earlier in 48, and is together with the Surinamese Museum among the few museums in the Dutch Caribbean dedicated to modern art. And through these sort of personal relationships between the Engels family and Sandberg, institutional interactions between Amsterdam and the Caribbean increased, and the Curaçao Museum became part of the Celix international network. And such institutions as the Curaçao Museum were often run and supported by members of the predominantly white cultural elite, and stood in close proximity with European or American institutions. And I would like to say that so much of the, and that's something we have to work on as well, that so much of the art historical narrative has propelled the same individuals into protagonists. And it's important to expand the narrative with Caribbean sites and agents that have made profound changes to our understanding of the region's art history. So from the 50s onwards, art in Curaçao became more part of the intellectual discourse. In Curaçao, artists and writers from groups such as the Getrapte in Dutch, or in English, the Humiliated, and organized exhibitions. The novelist Tip Maroeg was part of this group, as well as the painter Ruyas. But we need to conduct more archival research to get a better understanding of their aims and political position. So within the region itself, local artistic communities produced exhibitions, but also the Curaçao Museum supported and exhibited professional and amateur artists throughout the entire Dutch Caribbean via what we call sort of open call exhibitions, I would say. So an important example are the series of Exhibition des Nos-Arts that the Curaçao Museum organized since 1950s. And artists could send in their work, and a selection would be shown in the museum. And the 54 edition, for example, resulted in 400 contributions. So these were projects that really centered Caribbean perspectives on the developments in Curaçao. The Engels family also encouraged Sandberg in 1949 to visit Haiti, as the Centre de Art in Port-au-Prince, founded in 1944, became an important institution in the internationalization of Haitian art and attracted cultural figures like César and Breton. And Sandberg's journey was not only the impetus for exhibitions on contemporary artists from Haiti and Curaçao and Amsterdam, but also marked what I would like to call the distribution of various stedelijk exhibitions to the Curaçao Museum. Think, for example, of the collection of 37 Van Gogh paintings that were exhibited in Curaçao in 1954, unthinkable right now, or the unambiguously titled exhibition Pioneers from 1962, consisting of canonical works from the Stedelijk's collection. So what the Stedelijk did, in fact, is presenting a sort of dominant picture of modern art, narrated around canonical European white male artists in a rather fragile time of artistic renewal and developments of anti-colonial critique in Curaçao. This might be understood as a strategy to expand the museum's international program or simply support a befriended institution, but might also be seen as a cultural offense to secure Curaçao's culture dependence on the Dutch, which questions the institution's role in times of political change in the Dutch Caribbean. Furthermore, and this is maybe a bit of a far stretch, but although these exchanges were reliant on a handful of influential interlocutors and the Dutch Cultural Foundation's Tecusa as a major patron, a resemblance with MoMA's role in the activities of the CIA in advancing abstract expressionism as a sort of weapon of Cold War politics is rather tempting. So that would be a question of how circulating exhibitions on Eurocentric modernism influenced artistic developments in the post-war Dutch Caribbean.
So if the early 20th century European art was shaped by encounters with African art forms, the post-war period marked a shift towards European museums and galleries displaying artworks produced in the former colonies. The post-colonial period was also a time of increasing artistic mobility, with the artists from the Dutch Antilles and Suriname coming to the Netherlands for educational purposes. Think of Rudy Getrouw or Stuart Robles de Medina, who came in 1949. Yet, at the same time, there was also a growing institutional infrastructure of arts in the Dutch Caribbean, with the development of new art schools and cultural centers, but also in the Caribbean region. There seems to be this constant movement of artists, exhibitions, and cultural encounters between the Dutch Caribbean and Amsterdam in the post-war period. These entangled histories are part of the processes of artistic renewal in the Dutch Caribbean. One might call it the Renaissance, similar to the development in Haiti, which was in 1940s. The cultural movement had its own aesthetic tradition, with artists exploring both themes of modernity as cultural heritage, African cultural heritages. As some Dutch Caribbean artists came to the Netherlands to study at the Art Academy and traveled back and forth, their work would often be imbued with various references as well as with forms of abstraction, as this was one of the dominant idioms at that period. So someone like Carlito Gomez employed from Curacao, employed a strategy of counter-appropriation by means of redeploying surrealist motives. So his works informed by political developments in Curacao, such as the revolt in 1996. So to put it in another way, the story of Dutch Caribbean art is in great part shaped by the complex practices of Caribbean transnationalism. Sandberg's experience of Haitian art in the late 1940s impacted his understanding of what he called, and here we go with the art, like the problematic art historical references, primitive, the primitive impression that these artistic practices had developed in complete artistic isolation and without the influence of any colonial interference. The Stedelijk organized the first exhibition on Caribbean artists in 1950, titled 19 Painters from Haiti. Sandberg turned it into a touring exhibition that traveled to Paris, Munich, Bern, and people started calling it Sandberg's European Haitian show. Hence, the first works from the Caribbean entered the museum this way by this exhibition, and paintings such as from artists as Gessner, Abelard, and Robert St. Brice started taking their space in Stedelijk Museum. This Haitian art, from Sandberg's perspective, was mostly added into this vitality and ideas of authenticity that he kind of posited to artists like the Cobra Group. So these acquisitions marked a renewed interest in so-called naive art in the 1950s. But what Sandberg wasn't aware, or might have not mentioned, or might have not known of, was that these, what he called, what is called primitive aesthetics, were actually pushed by the American artist and educator David Peters at the Centre des Arts, and created a myth around this discovery of Haitian art. It was about a decade after the American occupation. So what was supposed to be this authentic idea was sometimes a more market-driven production. At the same time, the history of Haitian art, for example, the tradition of the religious objects and also the works from the indigenous movements or from local movements, were set aside and acknowledged in these new institutional European contexts as rather anachronistic. To finalize, a few years later, in 1953, the Stedelijk presented the exhibition Curaçao Paints and Painted, which traveled from Amsterdam to Curaçao, to the Curaçao Museum. Dutch Caribbean art historians like Adi Martens, Felix de Rooij, and Jennifer Smith have written about this importance of this canonical exhibition, as it brought together Caribbean contemporary artists as well as Dutch artists that had worked temporarily in Curaçao. Novel for the museum was the representation of Caribbean through the embodied work of local artists instead of via the imaginary worlds of Europeans. In that said, works that were presented at the exhibition too were these landscape painting and portraits that re-established the colonial gaze of the Western traveler, exploring the other, referring to both the Caribbean people and their land. The most important thing to note is that this exhibition was initiated by the Association of Antillean Students in the Netherlands, and not by the Stedelijk itself. Which makes this a key example of a new Dutch Caribbean self-redefinition through a cultural practice established against the background of anti-colonial nationalism. And so this exhibition might form or seem to be like a mediated way of dialogue in the process of cultural equality, which actually existed from the 50s.
Well done. Art history, we like. I was told it was going to be speculative.